Everybody, my name is Tom Johnson, and you'll hear from a variety of people tonight. We'll try to make this a really interesting evening for you. You'll soon have a formal welcome to the Atlanta History Center by Sheffield Hale, the splendid president of the History Center. And I would just say, Sheffield Hale, is he behind me already? Well, he's not been called on yet to welcome you. But before we do, there are so many people tonight that are not in this area. Our area appears to be safe, but I think all of us are thinking a lot about our friends in Florida and elsewhere who are now about to get the second dose of a terrible hurricane. It was upgraded, I think, to a 5 recently, so it really could be unbelievably destructive. But I thought that since he's here, I have a wonderful friend that I've known for much of my life. I first actually got to meet him when he was one of Dr. King's most important aides, and I was a young reporter for the Macon Telegraph. But Andy Young has held virtually every position that you can imagine. Mayor of this city, United States Congressman, United States Ambassador to the United Nations. But what I think of him as a very understated man, not at all a self-promoter, who does good deeds for others. And I have seen him in action in this city and elsewhere. He was just in Hartford, Connecticut, where he was doing a lot of good work there at an institution where he said his life was changed. But I just wanted Andy to have a word of prayer with us tonight before we get to Sheffield and the program. So, Ambassador.
If you don't mind, I'll sit. May we bow our heads and pray. Father, we come before Thee with bowed knees and humble hearts. We've been through a lot these last few months. The environment is in turmoil, and so is the politics and the humanities. And yet we know that You are a God that keeps order and brings order out of chaos. And we ask that You would bring some order to our spiritual lives, that the anxieties that perplex us and that the doubts and fears that interfere with our success and that the insecurities that lead to our failures somehow be transformed by Your love and by the confidence and the glory that we are able to share with each other on this evening. We ask Thy blessing on all those who are present. Be with us, inspire us, fill us with Thy Spirit, and use us to transform the heavens and the earth and make it possible for this planet, this neighborhood, this city, and our families to be more reflective of Thy kingdom in heaven. Amen.
Thank you, Ambassador Young and Tom. My name is Sheffield Hale, and I'm the President and CEO of the Atlanta History Center. I want to welcome you all here tonight. We're so excited about this very special author talk featuring William Cope Moyers discussing his new Open, What Painkillers Taught Me About Life and Recovery. Each of you have received a copy of this moving book, and you arrived tonight, and for that, and for this event being held here at the Atlanta History Center without charge, and for all the delicious food, we have Edwina and Tom Johnson to thank for us to thank tonight. He is another force of nature himself. And we are very appreciative of the Johnson support and dedication to spreading awareness about the addiction crisis and the resources available right here in Atlanta to help. Now, I only have two jobs I have to do tonight. One is to introduce a great American, and the other is to tell you to turn your cell phones off. So if you can do that and remind, that would be helpful. I always forget. To that end, I'm pleased to introduce Jack Harden, who will be sharing more about our partner in presenting this evening, the Addiction Alliance of Georgia, which is comprised of Hazleton Betty Ford Foundation and Emory Healthcare. Jack's a partner at Smith, Gambrell, and Russell. He's been a leader in the legal community for many decades, especially through his own blue chip firm, Rogers & Harden, which he founded in 1976 and merged with Smith Gambrell in 2022. Through it all, he's been a force in Atlanta humanitarian work. In addition to his involvement in the Addiction Alliance of Georgia, he's also deeply involved in addressing the challenge of homelessness in our Atlanta community as the chairman emeritus and founder of Gateway LLC, a homeless services center, and a member of the Board of Partners for Home, Inc. He's also currently the chairman of the Fulton County Board of Health and the president of other boards and community-based organizations. Jack has received more awards and recognition for his community involvement than we have time to recite tonight. I'll sum up by saying this: Jack Harden deeply cares about people and about Atlanta, and I'm honored that he's here to share with you the invaluable resources and story of the Addiction Alliance of Georgia. Please join me in welcoming a great lawyer, Jack Harden.
Sheffield, thank you for that, and thank you to the History Center and to Claire and all your staff for helping us pull this event off. I didn't really realize how much was involved in having a simple talk until we tried to pull this together, but thankfully, with your experience and your staff, it's been very smooth. Now, on behalf of Frank and Karen Boykin and Edwina and Tom Johnson and my wife Caroline, I want to welcome each and every one of you here. I appreciate very much your interest in this subject, which is very important to all of us. I've been asked to say a little bit about what the Addiction Alliance of Georgia is, so let me just jump into that. It's a joint venture between Emory Healthcare and Hazleton Betty Ford. Hazleton Betty Ford is the largest nonprofit provider of addiction treatment services in the country and a pioneer. And Emory, we all know as our proud institution based here in Atlanta. The origin of AAG is in the addiction illness of the son of Frank and Karen. And his illness took the same tortuous path that's so often the case, looking for resources, looking for help, until finally he connected with Hazleton Betty Ford, where he found sobriety and recovery. But the experience opened Frank and Karen's eyes to so much of what is missing in our country as it relates to this issue. And they set about to try to figure out what they could do to make it easier for those who came along behind with families challenged with this disease. In talking to various people, somebody said they should talk to Tom Johnson. And so they reached out to Tom. Tom reached out to tonight's speaker. And out of those conversations evolved the idea to exercise Tom's incredible convening power. Tom called together on short notice some 40-odd city leaders for the purpose of discussing the addiction crisis and testing to see if there was an appetite in this community to do something about it. We focused on two stark facts. One was that more people were dying each year, more Americans were dying each year from overdose deaths than died in the entire course of the Vietnam War. And the second one was the treatment capacity available for people afflicted with these illnesses was somewhere between 10 and 15% of the need. And opioid deaths were increasing every year, as they have every year until the last 12 months. So our fingers are crossed that we're seeing the beginning of a trend and not a statistical aberration. So we reached out to Hazleton Betty Ford and said, you guys are the biggest and the best. Would you come to Atlanta? Our inducement to you is there is an Atlanta community willing to stand up and support you in your efforts. And they said, you know, expanding our treatment capacity is really not on our horizon right now. What we're really focusing on is research and education. And we said, well, we happen to have a world-class research and education institution in Atlanta. Perhaps we could introduce the two of you. You could have some conversations, and we see where that goes. So the introduction were made, the conversations were had. It was decided that more study and research needed to be done to develop a specific strategy and a plan. So we chipped in a few dollars. We went and found some generous friends like the Fuqua family, and we funded that initial development. And we came up with a business plan and a strategy and decided to launch a $10 million campaign to realize the first stage of our goal. We hired a fantastic medical director who you'll have the opportunity to meet later tonight, Justine Welch, and then set out in the middle of the largest pandemic since the great flu epidemic of the early 20th century to raise money, when the attention of the world was highly focused on an entirely different medical problem. And it was a difficult raise, but with lead gifts from the Woodruff Foundation, the Rollins Foundation, the Cox Foundation, and individual gifts from hundreds of other people, we were able to raise about $12 million. We built out 9,000 square feet of clinic space deep in the Wesley Woods on the Emory Hospital campus and commenced services. We contracted with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities on the education side to begin to provide training for the community service boards supported and funded by DVHDD around the state. We discovered that med school curricula do not include any training on addiction medicine. Developments in addiction medicine post-dated the developments of med school curricula. So we developed a module and offered it starting with the Georgia medical institutions, to begin to familiarize medical trainees with what was available, and a number of other programs pursuing treatment, research, and education. And I'm proud to say that we've been open for about 2 years now. We've treated over 1,100 distinct individuals with thousands of medical appointments. And we're beginning to make a difference. We're hopeful that signs are pointing in the right direction with the funds flowing into the state from the opioid settlements, with increased awareness and now some slight signs of progress in dealing with this. But the Addiction Alliance of Georgia has big ambitions to be as impactful in this community as the Shepherd Center has been on spinal diseases. And we have a long way to go, and it's a little hubris for us to spout those ambitions, but without a goal, you never achieve anything. Now, Frank and Tom and I call ourselves the founders of the Addiction Alliance of Georgia because we don't really have any position, and we have to have something, so we said we're the founders. But the catalyst was Frank and Karen Borkin. The inspiration was William Cope Moyers. And the trail boss who cracked the whip, kept us going, kept our eyes on the prize, drove us nuts and occasionally encouraged us, but was an irresistible force to get us from where we started to where we are today. Now, most of you in this room know Tom as a journalist and a legendary news executive, which he is. He is also a fundraiser and a philanthropist and an irresistible force when he turns his attention to accomplishing something good for the community. So now I'm going to ask Tom to come up and introduce William Cope Moyers.
Jack, thank you. Introducing William Cope Moyers to you tonight is somewhat like introducing my own son. The relationship between William's family and my own has been and continues to be very close. His father, Bill Moyers, was White House press secretary in 1965 when I was selected at age 24 as a White House Fellow. Bill chose me out of 15 to serve as his assistant for a year. That was an extraordinary experience. At 24, Bill Moyers was 31. Later, when William's dad, Bill Moyers, became the highly respected journalist at CBS, he asked our son Wyatt to work with him at the CBS Evening News. That was a life-changing experience for Wyatt. Much like his father, and I guess like me, Cope Moyers, as I still call him, chose journalism as his career. He worked with me as a reporter at the Dallas Times-Herald and at CNN. Never have I met a more promising writer or reporter. I had the opportunity to do for William what his father had done for me, to become one of his mentors. Before joining CNN, William explained that he had taken leaves of absence from his previous reporting jobs to seek treatment for his addictive use of alcohol and cocaine, including crack. He told me, and I believe this is a full exact quote, "Tom, it's been 2 years. I'm in full recovery now. The worst days and the bad times are behind me." I believed him. But 2 years later, in 1994, his illness suddenly roared back and he found himself very much in the clutches of a relapse. He was unable to just say no to the cold beer and the hot crack cocaine that drove him to his knees in a dilapidated apartment in one of the worst parts of our city of Atlanta. He knew he was in trouble. He had gone AWOL on his young family, his wife and 2 small boys. But he couldn't escape. Addiction had hijacked his brain and stolen his soul. All he wanted to do was to get high or to die. Along with his parents, Judith and Bill Moyers, I decided to do whatever I could to save him from the illness that was about to kill him. Within 24 hours, we'd assembled a team of off-duty Atlanta police officers to track him down. And incidentally, if you ever would like to know the location of all the crack houses in town, go to the Atlanta Taxi Drivers Association. Seriously, they know where everyone is tonight. And frequently they've taken or picked up people at those sites. His parents retained a retired deputy sheriff who'd become an interventionist to give him out of the crack house at the intersection of Ponce de Leon and Boulevard, not far from where we are tonight. After he had completed another round of treatments, Cope came to my office at CNN, and I asked him if he was ready to get back. I told him, "Cope, we are ready for you. We really have missed you." Much to my surprise and much to my regret, Cope said that he was leaving CNN. He said that he had to get back to the community of people in the Twin Cities of Minnesota and St. Paul because it was there that he could find the support that he so badly needed from people just like him. He was determined to move away from what would have been a splendid future at CNN. But he knew he had to go to a place for people like himself to get away from journalism and to get out from under the shadow of his own father's brilliant career. Now, neither one of us could have imagined that 24 years later, in 2018, he and I, along with Frank Boykin and Jack Harden, would begin a process here to create in Atlanta a place for people just like him and families just like the Moyers. We told William, he was then at Hazleton, we told William we need Hazleton in this community to help addicts and alcoholics receive the treatment they need. I personally had seen too many people suffering, too many people with no place to go here for quality help, quality help. It took more than 4 years of endless meetings with local and state leaders, and so many of you in this audience, and raising with incredible difficulty $12 million, as Jack said. There is a perception, incidentally, that addicts are not white people. They are people that we see at times on the streets that are homeless, or we somehow think that they are black people or Hispanic people. But I can assure you from the statistics that addiction affects every single strata of our lives, from the rich, the poor, the black, the white, the brown, and many others. It is not make any distinction about what people that it hits. In any case, with donors, so many of you in this room, and a few that I am still working on, like Glenn Hagan, we are working to create a partnership that is today called the Addiction Alliance of Georgia. It will serve all of the people of this state, not just Atlanta. So that's why we invited you here tonight, to raise awareness. We are determined with your help to do more, to do much more, to help addicts and alcoholics and their families in our community and throughout the state of Georgia. And I tell you, it makes you feel so much better inside when you can see a person get back on track with their lives, become productive members of our community. It is now my honor to introduce to you my other son, William Cope Moyers. Thank you. All right.
Well, after all that, what is there left to say? But I am so grateful, Tom, for your introduction, for Jack's, and I'm so awed, actually, but that you all are here on a Tuesday night. Is it Tuesday night? I can't remember. Thank you, Kelly. It's on a Tuesday night with a lot going on in our own lives and in the lives of this country, that we would take the time to gather here in a safe space, safe place, to celebrate what we've done with the Addiction Alliance of Georgia, but also recognize that we have a long way to go, and that we're actually here tonight for the people who are not here tonight. And we'll come back to that when I get done. I just want to thank Sheffield and Claire and the remarkable team at the Atlanta History Center for pulling this off, top rated. You know, I've been in Atlanta, in the last 10 days, I've been in Anchorage, Alaska, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, Santa Monica, St. Paul, and other places I can't remember, and this is a class act right here. So I'm really grateful to be here, and again, as I said, I'm grateful that you are too. It has been 30 years, as Tom said. It's been 30 years, but in hearing Tom tell the story of what happened to me way back when, 30 years ago, well, that story resonates with me this evening as it has whenever I recall that moment. It's what proved to be the turning point, not a turning point, but the turning point. When I stood at the literal crossroads and had to decide if I would pursue oblivion and with it plunge into the abyss of dark despair, or go the other way and take those first improbable steps towards the help and the healing that Tom and others had created. Indeed, it was 30 years ago today, October the 8th, 1994, that I kissed my two baby boys, Henry and Thomas, who were born here in Atlanta, and Thomas, who's named for Tom Johnson. I kissed them goodbye, and I told my wife that I needed to run some errands before dinner, and I drove off from our home on Noble Drive in the Morningside neighborhood of Atlanta, not to run some errands, but to run away from what my life had become. Because in that life, I had reached a point where I could not imagine living under the influence of substances any more than I could imagine my life without those substances. I just wanted to die. And I figured that I would do it at the crack house on Boulevard and Ponce. an intersection about 6 miles from where we stand right now, here at the Atlanta History Center. 6 miles, and now 30 years later. 6 miles and 30 years later. Glad these pages are marked. Thanks to this community for sticking with me 30 years ago. I doubt I would be here right now if not for the loving support of so many people back then. The loving support of so many people back then who hated my illness, but continued to love me. The support of so many people who have walked my walk with me to this moment. Indeed, a day at a time does add up after a while. 3 decades now, Atlanta has played a formative role in my journey from addiction to redemption and beyond. This city, this community, many of you who are here this evening, it's not hyperbole or exaggeration to say that the genesis of every important opportunity that I have had in the past 30 years, every opportunity and every person that I've met along my journey of recovery, every bit of it was fostered by what happened to me when I overcame my addiction and found sustained recovery here in Atlanta 30 years ago. No wonder I have been back so many times since. Indeed, I have spoken in Atlanta more than in any other city outside of the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, where I moved, as Tom said, where I moved after I completed my treatment at Ridgeview Institute in Smyrna under the care of Dr. Paul Early, who I think is here tonight. Is Dr. Early here? Paul. Thank you for still being here. Dr. Paul Early and the family therapist who I met tonight for the first time in probably 30 years, Mike McHugh. Is Mike here too? Mike, thanks. Because as we know, addiction is the disease that affects much more than just the individual who has it. It affects the whole family. So it's no accident that I keep coming back to Atlanta, even though I moved to Minnesota because I knew I would better my chances to recover if I was to move to the Mecca of recovery in America. I call Minneapolis and St. Paul the crossroads of recovery in America, and that's because there are thousands of people like me who have known firsthand the grip of addiction and know the freedom that comes with recovery. But Atlanta remains my home away from home, my home where my heart is, my North Star down south, the bright and steady light that continues to guide me 30 years later, starting with my own recovery and with it, everything that has flowed from my life originates here in Atlanta. From my advocacy and my commitment to helping people to my fundraising, without this bright light of Atlanta, I could not have seen a way out and I could not have seen a way forward. No wonder that moment in Atlanta on October the 12th of 1994, 4 days short of 30 years now, October the 12th of 94, no wonder that is the prologue of my first memoir, Broken, my story of addiction and redemption. The prologue that includes that scene outside of the crack house when my father, in his sheer agony of desperation and fear and frustration and anger, when my father said to me, "I hate you," and when I responded with my own desperation and fear and frustration and anger and shame, "I hate me too." Many of you who are here tonight have heard me read that prologue over the decades when I've come back to Georgia and come back to Atlanta to speak, and so there's no need for me to read it tonight. That was a long time ago. Even though recalling it just now, even recalling that exchange with my father continues to make the hair stand up on the back of my head, continues to make the hair on my arms quiver, and gives my stomach nausea. Because while time does heal all wounds, my scars are still sensitive to touch, and my scars of those days back then still ache. That was a long time ago, and I don't read from this book much anymore because it was a long time ago and because I got a new one. It's a new memoir called Broken Open, and it includes a new prologue as well. Well, actually, not a new prologue per se, but a foreword by my friend, the singer-songwriter Roseanne Cash, who writes in the prologue, or in the foreword, quote, this is not a redemption story. This is not even a singular story of addiction and recovery. This is an honest account of a man in his complicated journey through the prison of substance use and misuse, following a path that led to a fragile and precious sobriety and a new understanding of that very word. This is not a redemption story. Now, I know there are a few of you out there who may be wondering, well, wait a minute. How could it not be a redemption story? What do you mean it's not a singular story of addiction and recovery? What do you mean it's a complicated journey through the prison of substance use and misuse? Wasn't that what Broken was all about? Moyers got addicted, kept relapsing, went to treatment many times, and finally that scene on Boulevard and Ponce de Leon Avenues, his story turned from addiction to the first steps of redemption. And yes, that's what this book is all about. Broken, my story of addiction and redemption. Addiction, the bottom, and then redemption. V for victory. But this book is 19 years old. It recounts that day on Boulevard and Ponce in 1994, and 6 or 8 years later, I wrote this story of addiction and redemption. My story of going down, hitting bottom, and coming back up. And by the way, there is only one bottom with this illness. We use that term very loosely, but the only bottom with this illness is death. And anything short of that is a way out. So if you're struggling with a substance use problem tonight or with mental health issues, don't wait till you hit bottom. And if you're a family member who is struggling with a loved one who has a substance use or mental health issue, don't wait till your loved one hits bottom, because then it's too late. But Broken was all about my story of addiction and redemption, the V-shaped recovery in which I lived happily ever after. And that is not true. I mean, don't get me wrong, Broken is a true story. It was true up to then, but it's 19 years old, and I have been living up to this book. I have been living up to this recovery for the last 19 years. My new memoir is not that simple. In 2014, 10 years ago, almost 20 years after I left that crack house for the last time, addiction found me in the pharmacy. And I read this from my new book, Broken Open, What Painkillers Taught Me About Life and Recovery. And this is from the chapter, page 124 of Broken Open. It's called Breaking Point, and it recounts what happened to me after I had dental surgery in 2012. On the fourth morning after my dental procedure, I sensed that there was more to my pill popping than pain relief. That day, I wrote in my journal again. I wrote this: these past 3 days, I've bumped up against the tempting grip of pain meds. Basked in the warm, euphoric glow of the buzz, I sat at my desk listening to music, banging out emails, getting stuff done. Schemed the timing to do it again yesterday, and I did, +1. +1. I had taken an extra pill. The bottle said 2. I took 3. To most people, that might not seem like a big deal. Perhaps a larger dose makes them feel woozy or slightly out of it, makes their bad day a bit better and their good day a bit more pleasant. Either way, they might like that feeling, but my guess is they don't need an extra pill to get there. Besides, not many people would take an extra pill, a +1, because they trust that the instructions on the side of the bottle are there for a specific reason. Take 2 every 4 to 6 hours means exactly what it says. It doesn't mean 1 more pill or 1 less hour. I can read directions, And I have my share of common sense. Most of what I've learned comes from the mistakes I've made and successes over the years. I also learn from others' accounts. I have heard the stories of people who suddenly found themselves spinning out of control and falling into trouble after being prescribed mood and mind-altering medications, especially pain meds. Those stories always seem to start the same way. I broke my arm, or I needed a root canal, or I finally had the surgery to replace my knee. The medical procedure is legitimate, and the medication prescribed is meant to provide relief from real pain. But somewhere along the way, something changes. Some people describe it as a slow unfolding, like a seed pushing up from the soil. Others say it hits like a lightning bolt out of the blue sky. Mostly it seems to happen somewhere between slow motion and the blink of an eye. For too many people, what happens next is inevitable. The medication that started as a solution becomes a problem. And that's what happened to me. I found addiction found me in the pharmacy. For 3 years, I struggled on and off with my baffling inability to just say no. I loved my recovery. How could I not? It had been the essence of my whole life. I wore my recovery on my sleeve. I am a public advocate for Hazel and Betty Ford and for the Addiction Alliance of Georgia. I loved my recovery, but I could not regain my sobriety. Big difference for a guy who hasn't been in a crack house or taken a drink in a bar since October 12th of 1994. I could not get off of those pain meds of my own free will. I could not get off of those pain pills from my well-heeled, well-utilized 12-step program. I could not get off of those pain meds by getting on my knees and praying to God for deliverance. I could not quiet this craving brain. Again, I loved my recovery, but I could not regain my sobriety. I loved my recovery to the extent that I was not about to go back to the crack house or to the bar. I knew that's not what the answer was. But I could not stop this thing from craving. It didn't help that I had chronic pain as well. I had developed a neuralgia in my jaw as a result of that dental procedure that didn't go right. And I mention that to you tonight because chronic pain is a big issue in any medical system, but it's also a big issue in a society in which 6,000 of us are turning 65 every day this year, including me. Chronic pain is an issue, and we should not deny people who have chronic pain the appropriate use of medications to ease that pain. I had chronic pain, yes, but I also had a story of recovery. And the tug of war between those two and the way the pain meds got into that tug of war was like nothing I had ever experienced. Broken open, what painkillers taught me about life and recovery, what it taught me about addiction, treatment and recovery, my own and those people around me. During that 3-year period between 2012, 2013, and early 2016, I had many teachable lessons and many teachable moments. Here are a few of them that I think are relevant to this evening's gathering. Number one, the popular saying in 12-step recovery that a drug is a drug is a drug, that's not true. It's just not true when it comes to opiates, and it's why we have an opiate epidemic in this country. Opiates, as I say, are the Trojan horse of addiction in America. They are like no other substance I had ever experienced, and I always, by the way, hated opiates until I loved those pain pills. A drug is not a drug, is not a drug, is not a drug, and we can't treat addiction as if there's one size shoe that fits all when it comes to drug use. Hope is a strategy. Hope is a strategy. I know it's not a strategy in business. You can't hope your way to selling more widgets or hope your way to filling more chairs at the Addiction Alliance of Georgia or hope your way to a winning season in football. You got to have a strategy. But when you or a loved one are struggling with addiction, as I was, I held on to hope. I held on to hope that I could find my way through this, or that I would find a way through this if I could just hang on to hope. In fact, I held on to hope by holding on to my recovery. I wasn't sober, but I loved my life in recovery, and I held on to that. That was the hope I needed to get through to the point I'm about to get to. Finally, all those tools that I had used before, as I mentioned, 12 steps, my faith, my job, they weren't enough. They weren't enough. When it came to my craving brain, the science, as I was to discover, the science of addiction is as important as the 12 steps and my faith and my job. Indeed, I needed more than I had ever had before to get back on track and to stay on track. And so in January of 2016, after 3 years of struggling on and off with this cunning, baffling, powerful, and patient illness, addiction, in 2016, in early 2016, I found the answer. It was a medication prescribed to me by an addiction psychiatrist in Minneapolis, an anti-craving medication approved by the FDA to quiet this craving brain. It's called Suboxone, buprenorphine. And you know what? It worked. It worked like a magic bullet for me because I had all those other aspects of my recovery in place. I had those memories of Atlanta still at the forefront. I had all those things that I loved, but I could not quiet this brain until I took that medication, and that medication quieted my brain, and suddenly I could see and hear and believe again. And when I did, I surrounded myself with my faith. I surrounded myself with my advocacy job at Hazel, and I surrounded myself with an infrastructure that tells me that there is more to my recovery than there is sobriety. There is more to my recovery than sobriety. There are many pathways to recovery. And in my case, this wasn't about starting over. This wasn't about starting again. But for this addict and alcoholic who had this run-in with pain meds, it was about keeping going. And when I kept going, once again, here I was in Atlanta, playing a formative role, this city playing a formative role in my story, my North Star of a new orientation, my teacher with new lessons, my purpose with renewed vigor. It was here that I began new chapters of my life, my story, a place of experiences, opportunities, challenges, and most of all, a place of people. People like me from families like mine. And it was here that I could use my story and my journey, professionally and personally, to do for others what had been happening to me, which was another chance and access to treatment and medication and all those things that are part of my recovery journey. In 2018, 2 years after my struggle with the pain meds ended, Tom Johnson called me. He didn't know what had happened. He called me that day. I was at my desk in Minnesota. It was bitter cold up there, and it was Tom calling in. He said to me, "We want to do for addiction treatment in Atlanta what we did for the Olympics in 1996. Oh, okay. You know, that's Tom. Tom said, "We want to bring Hazel and Betty Ford to Atlanta to provide world-class treatment." Now, Tom's been ambitious since the day he was born. No wonder he lives in Atlanta, because this, as Ambassador Young knows, this is an ambitious town. And when it puts its mind to something, it gets it done. And here I was, Here I was spending more and more of my time understanding what was lacking, what was needed, what we at Hazel and Betty Ford could do to expand access to treatment, how to fund it, and how to tap into and strengthen the community of recovery that is represented here tonight in this auditorium. The story of the Addiction Alliance of Georgia, you've heard it already through Jack and through Tom. It's not one that I can tell tonight because I don't need to. It's too involved, it's too exciting, and besides, we're almost out of time. But my point is, I began to spend a lot of time in Atlanta and a lot of time in Georgia as we began to put this project together. I spent a lot of time here with my colleagues from Hazel and Betty Ford, Kelly Geiser, who's right there. Kelly, the preeminent fundraiser for our organization, thank you. And Danielle Kretman, who kept this project together and headed to success. Where's Danielle? Where is she? I don't see her. Oh, she's hiding in the back. Danielle, oh, you're looking at your phone. No, teasing. Danielle and Kelly, my colleagues, wow, what a privilege to work with both of you. That team of fundraisers from Emory Healthcare, which were really right on top of things. But most of all, that team of experts led by Dr. Justine Welsh. Right here, what a gift this community has in Dr. Welsh and her team's efforts. I got to hang out with philanthropy partners that agreed to invest in what we were trying to do. You heard them tonight, Woodruff and Cox and Rollins and Chick-fil-A. I got to hang out in this town with donors and volunteers like Carolyn and Jack Harden and Karen and Frank Boykin. Where's Karen? There's Karen. Frank couldn't make it, but Karen and Frank Boykin and Cindy and Bill Fowler and Steve Shadoin back there. And of course, Tom. And you know, the more I hung around in this town, the more I began to engage professionals like Tyler Driver and his team from the Extension. I don't know if Tyler's here tonight. I know there he is in the back. Tyler, what you and your team are doing up north of here and helping people. I got to hang out with Beth Finnerty at Skyland Trail. I don't know if she made it tonight, but oh, there you are, Beth, right there. Helping people who need and deserve what nobody else is hardly giving them. Skyland Trail. I got to hang out with Dr. Patrice Harris. I don't know if Dr. Harris is there. Oh, there you are. Former head of the AMA, living right here in the hood. Wow. Dr. Freierhofer and Guy Milner. I mean, I got to hang out with a lot of people that propped me up and carried me on and helped me believe. I even got to hang out with some journalists who get it. Like Jeremy Redmond from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I don't know if Jeremy's still here. He was here earlier. Jeremy Redmond, and of course, Maria Saporta. Maria. Jay Watson, who created Your Fantastic Mind. I got to hang out in houses of worship, civic organizations, and with elected officials across the political spectrum, because as we know, addiction is a bipartisan illness that demands a bipartisan solution. And as I hung out down here in Atlanta, at that time I had been off the pain pills for 2, 3, 4, 5 years through the pandemic. I began to realize that I was a part of something bigger. Indeed, the sum is greater than the parts. That's true in a lot of communities, but here in Atlanta, the sum is greater than the parts in the way that only Atlanta can make happen. And along the way in hanging out here and trying to put together this collaboration, this partnership, this joint effort, this effort to make a difference with Emory, I began to realize that there was something else going on in my journey. My story still mattered. My story still mattered. Remember, I had to live up to this book. And it was true, but it was 19 years old. And I had to live up to this book. People come up and say, oh, William, I want to be like you one day. And I say, be careful what you ask for. I had to live up to this book. But then I realized my story still mattered, even if my story had changed. And some or most of the people that I got to hang around with were people who were struggling not only with addiction in Atlanta, and not only with addiction in Georgia, but people who were struggling specifically with opioids. Interesting. Indeed, the opioid epidemic touched Atlanta and touched Georgia like it has every other state. And Jack mentioned that the numbers have gone down a little bit, but more people are dying of accidental overdoses in this country this year than were killed in the entire war in Vietnam still. And when I would hang out with these people and I listened to them, I realized how much more I had to offer if I was willing to tell my story. I would listen mostly, and I would offer counsel, and I would sometimes give people this book if they didn't have it. But almost, as I said, almost every conversation was about opiates, about how people could not find care, or worse, they could find care, but they could not find the medication that was so important to the care they got. People were relapsing over and over. They couldn't get their children well. They couldn't find relief in church or in their 12-step meetings, and they were all struggling with shame and stigma. Every time I heard my story during those years, I saw myself. And I remembered the desperation and the shame back on Ponce and Boulevard, and I remembered the desperation and shame when I could not get off of those opiates of my own free will decades later. So I began to share my story with people in this community in a way I hadn't shared with any other community. For one reason, because I was spending a lot of time here, but also because, well, people like to tell stories in Georgia. And the story they wanted to tell was a story that was often about addiction and recovery, or addiction and the need for recovery. I began to share my story with people who had read Broken and assumed that mine was still this V for victory-shaped recovery. I remember meeting a mother and her daughter at a Whole Foods in Midtown, and I told them about my experience with opiates and the solution that I found. You know what I had discovered when I told them that? I gave them hope. And when I gave them hope, they gave me hope. I met another young man at the same Whole Foods another time who told me how his mentor in recovery was against the use of medications. I told this young man that it was okay. I gave that young man hope that day, and he helped me too. On a trip right before the pandemic in March of 2020, I met a family who I knew the moment I saw them were grieving because they had lost their loved one to this illness. And I told them that even though they had lost their son, they deserved to recover in their own right. I gave them hope, and they gave me hope. On another trip, I met an attorney who told me he was too ashamed to admit to his law firm that long after he had stopped drinking, long after his firm had held him up as a model of success in recovery, that he too had sought outpatient treatment for his dependency on pills. He wanted guidance. I gave him hope. He gave me hope. And about 2 years ago, Kelly and I were at a rally at the Capitol here, not too far from where we are. Jeff Breedlove, I don't know if Jeff's here tonight, but Jeff and his organization helped to lead that rally at the Capitol, and I met a woman on the street who was wearing a button with a picture of a young man who was her son. I asked her story as we stood at the intersection. She told me that he had died because he was denied access to the medication that I was taking. When she told me that story, when she told me that her life's work was all about keeping his story alive and making sure that it didn't happen to others, I encouraged her to keep fighting, and she helped me to fight too. Indeed, Atlanta continues to provide me with the sustenance that I need to stay the course of my own journey in recovery. Just look at the turnout here tonight. As I said at the beginning, I've been in a lot of places in the last couple of weeks, and this is the largest turnout for a difficult subject that I've had anywhere that I've been. Why? Well, for one thing, Tom and Edwin they host a heck of a show. But honestly, the turnout is because you're here because you care. You are here as residents of Atlanta or Georgia because you care today like I was cared for 30 years ago. And so I have hope that this community, through the Addiction Alliance of Georgia, the Extension, professionals like Dr. Early, journalists like Maria Saporta, donors and foundations, I have hope that Atlanta and Georgia will continue to embrace a can-do attitude when it comes to issues like treatment and recovery, that you will continue to expand access to care for all people who need and deserve what I got and what I have been given. I hope that this turnout tonight will result in the kind of change that will reach across all communities, not just the community that's mostly represented in this room tonight. And so that's why, as I close, I'm going to ask you to do something for me, for Kelly and Danielle, for Dr. Welsh, for every treatment program that's represented here, and mostly I'm going to ask you to do something for those who are not here tonight. I am going to read from this book, actually. I'm going to read the prologue of my book, first book. It's just 3 paragraphs. It's not even a prologue, it's the epigraph. It says this, and some of you have heard me read this before. A disciple asks the Rebbe, why does Torah tell us to place these words upon your hearts? Why does it not tell us to place these holy words in our hearts? The Rebbe answers, well, it is because as we are, our hearts are closed, and we cannot place the holy words in our hearts. So we place them on top of our hearts, and there they stay until one day the heart breaks and the words fall in. What I ask you to do tonight is the same thing that I was given 30 years ago, and that's a chance that comes with hope. I'm going to ask all of you to leave here this evening, as you will after we have a little Q&A, right, Claire? We have a little bit of Q&A, but I'm going to ask that you leave here tonight and go back into your community, however you define your community, and I want you to tell somebody that doesn't know it, I want you to tell somebody why you came here tonight. What was it that brought you here? Because I have a hunch everybody is here because you care. And so I'm going to ask you to leave this gathering. I'm going to take your experience of being here tonight. I'm going to take that and place those words of the experience that you've had here tonight, place those words on the heart of somebody where those words will sit until one day their hearts break and those words fall in. Thanks very much for taking the time. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for paying it forward in a way that will make a difference in the lives of people like me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us tonight. We are going to move to some questions and answers. Now, we know that this is a sensitive subject, so we're giving the option for written Q&A if anyone's more comfortable submitting their questions that way. My colleagues are going to be keeping a lookout for you. So if you have a question, we have one here in the front. They'll come by and grab them. But in the meantime, we're going to alternate between verbal and written. So if anyone has a verbal question, I will come to you. I'm going to go to the back and work my way forward.
Thank you. Is the Suboxone something that you still take, or is like an anti-anxiety pill that I still take, or is it a short-term thing that you taper off?
Well, thank you for that question. I don't know if you heard it. The question is, do you still take the anti-craving medication, Suboxone, in the same way that you still take your anti-anxiety meds? So thanks. Before I answer that question, let me ask you, why is that an important question to you?
Because my first thought is it feels not genuine, like genuine recovery. Then my second thought is, well, Jan, you still take your anti-anxiety, so maybe it's the same.
Yeah, good way to look at it. In the same way that a lot of people in recovery continue to smoke cigarettes. Nicotine is a drug. And a lot of people maintain their recoveries by smoking themselves to death. The co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, 2 of the great men of the 20th century, smoked themselves to death in sobriety. thank goodness they were around because they helped create this great social movement. So thank you for asking the question. Yes, I still take my medication. Of course I have to take my medication. Why would I not take my medication? In the same way the diabetic takes his or her insulin, or the hypertensive takes their Lipitor, or the depressive takes their Prozac, or the anti-anxiety person takes their anti-anxiety med. I take my meds because it works, and I don't want to mess with success. You know, there was a time when people saw the use of anti-craving medication as a crutch. Well, maybe it is, but I'd rather have a crutch while I walk than not walk at all. So now let me say this to you too. Hazel and Betty Ford is an abstinence-based program, and the Addiction Alliance of Georgia believes in the 12 steps as well, right, Dr. Welsh? And good. We hang the 12 steps on our walls at Hazel, and we're an abstinence-based program, but we use Suboxone to treat our patients as we do at the Addiction Alliance of Georgia because it works. There was a time when we implemented that program when we were seen as the devil incarnate, and because we were going against the sobriety thing or the 12 steps. And there was also a time when we thought we would taper people off of the medication after a while, but we decided that's not a good idea if they don't want to taper, because it works. In the same way, I think, as you shared your anti-anxiety meds, you're here tonight because you probably took your meds. Me too.
William,
Yes.
I have a written question from a member of
Sure.
the audience. The question reads, what happened to you happened to me at 26 years of sobriety. And this person asks, how do you deal with the few closed-minded, self-elected judges?
I pray for them. I respect other opinions in the same way I respect many pathways to recovery. But I disagree with them, and that's okay too. Some people have called me brave for writing Broken, and some have called me crazy for writing Broken Open. But you know, I wear my recovery on my sleeve. I've been a public advocate at Hazelden since I left CNN in 1994 and moved back to Minnesota and got a job there at Hazelden 2 years later, go figure. And you know, I have used my story, my own experience, to smash stigma. But I've also used my story to promote well-being and hope. And none of the people who've contacted me in Georgia and wanted to meet me at Whole Foods or on a street corner or at a meeting or something, none of them would have known to do that if I hadn't shared my story. So I'm going to keep sharing my story and being open about it. And if people agree with me, that's wonderful. And if they don't, that's okay too. I respect that.
Good evening, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I listened to Broken several years ago.
Uh-oh.
And I was just a few steps away from, why don't people just say no?
Yeah.
And but once I listened to that book, it changed my perspective completely. I really felt like I understood intellectually, at least the lure of addiction. It was written so well and so candidly. I just
Thank you.
felt like
Thank
I
you.
really got it. And I cannot tell you how many people I've told about this book. And you have given hope to so many people that you don't even know. And yes, your story still matters. And I thank you for your honesty, and I thank you for your candor.
Thank you, but can I ask, hold on. I got to ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
Since you were making more of a comment than you were asking a question. What brought you here tonight?
I hate driving. I drove over an hour to get here. To tell you that, I'm telling you, this book has meant so much to me. Addiction is not part of my experience. It's not part of the experience of many people who I know, but I get it now, and I understand, and people who are here, they mentioned, there may be some people who are dealing with that. There are people like me who need your book so that we can understand it, and that's why I'm here. Thank you for...
I want you to go back to where you came from, an hour, drive safely when you do it, okay? Don't listen to any of my books on tape while you're driving back. And when you get back to your community, I want you to share this experience tonight. Put it on the heart of somebody else.
I'm going to do that. I'm a college professor
Oh.
at Tuskegee University, and I'm going to talk about
I want to come and speak there. Whenever you invite me. All right. Thank you. Do we have, oh, here we are in the back.
Hi. So does Suboxone work for other drugs other than opiates? Because certain drugs like naltrexone, they're prescribed off-label for stuff like alcohol. Does
Yeah.
Suboxone have the same crossover?
So I'm not a clinician, in case you're wondering. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism, class of 1981 from Washington Lee University, and I very carefully don't field good questions like that, but I know who the experts are, and so I'm going to let Justine, Dr. Welsh, take this one.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. It doesn't have as much crossover as something like naltrexone, which works for alcohol and opioid use disorders, but it is FDA approved for chronic pain. So while William is talking about dealing with issues related to chronic pain and opioid use disorder, Suboxone can be particularly helpful.
Thank you, Justine. By the way, I use the Suboxone also off-label. I guess it's called off-label to help manage the chronic pain of my neuralgia, and it really, really works when I have severe outbreaks of it.
This is a written question from the audience. This question asks, how long into your opioid use did you realize that you were abusing? Like, what was the time period from starting the medication to when you realized there was an issue?
Well, when I wrote, I keep a journal, and if anyone out there aspires to be a writer, the best thing you can do is keep a journal. A page a day is a book a year. That said, it took me 6 years to write this book because my perspective kept evolving. But I kept going back to my journals because they were written in real time during that time. And I read tonight that excerpt about the +1. I probably knew that day in early 2013 or whenever it was that that's not what I ought to do. And I noted it to the extent I wrote it down, +1. So I knew early on, but I thought I could manage it. I seemed to manage it at times. I traveled a lot, and whenever I would fly, this would flare up. Whenever I'd go up in the air, it would and go down. It was a problem. But a lot of that was sort of self-rationalization and justification. You know how we are. And so I knew pretty early in the experience that this was not a good idea, but it took a while to figure it out. Hold on. There we go. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh is right. And I'm in recovery. I'm an addict.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's great to be here. My friend got me a ticket, and you told my story, thank you.
Oh.
And I have to say that the best thing that happened to me was the day I picked up pills, because I didn't realize, I knew that I couldn't do alcohol anymore, but I didn't realize that one of anything is too many, 1,000 is not enough. And I knew the minute that I took the pills in the wrong amount, too close together, that I was off and running. And what you said about putting it on your heart and it just sits there, and then when your heart breaks, that's how I feel now, is that my heart is wide open.
Good.
And it's all in there, and I've never been happier.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yes, and I appreciate what you said tonight and your honesty and everything, and I can't wait to read this book.
Thanks. Let me just say something, too. The medical profession is sort of grossly negligent when it comes to understanding addiction and mental health issues, particularly addiction issues. And I know Paul Early out there can talk about that. Dr. Welsh can, too. But we just don't do enough to educate doctors and dentists around not just addiction, but what recovery is, so that if they're going to prescribe to people like me, and I'm not going to be the very best patient and let you know everything about me, then those doctors need to be sort of aware of that too, as you probably experienced. So anyway, by the way, a lot of people have said, well, what did the doctors who were prescribing to you, what did they think? And honestly, they thought I was handling it just fine until they weren't thinking I was handling it just fine, because I continued to look good, and that was the other baffling part of this. In the old days, I would always make a sharp right turn. Like when I kissed my 2 baby boys and my wife goodbye and went to the crack house when I said I was going to run some errands. That was a sharp right turn. I had always done that in the past. That was my MO, and I would disappear. But when I was struggling with the pain meds, I continued to show up and help the AAG. Well, no, I guess I was not using the pain meds by then, but I was helping raise money. Kelly and I were raising lots of money, millions of dollars at Hazel and Betty Ford for other things. And I was doing all those things that made me look good and made me sound good, even though I was really struggling inside, which is what part of the baffling part of this illness was for me. It was so unlike anything that had ever happened to me in the past. And I just lastly want to say, I mean, I think it's still true, right, Paul? The doctors are just, they don't get much in terms of education around these issues in med schools, do they? We're working on it. You're working on it through ASAM and through other opportunities. And thanks to what's happening at Emory, yes. So bravo to Emory again. Yes.
So we have so many good questions, first of
Okay.
all, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. I wanted to read this one, though, and then I'm going to go to an audience member, then I promise I'm coming to you in the back. But this question I thought was really important to ask. And this audience member asked, what happened to the others who were in that crack house with you in Atlanta?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because I think about them all the time. It's 30 years ago. And I know what happened to all of them. And I only know it because back in the late 90s or early 2000s, I was lecturing at Emory long before we ever thought we would be in this wonderful relationship. And a woman, I was lecturing in a school of social work, and a woman interrupted me in the middle of my conversation, in my lecture, and she said, Mr. Moyers, we know what happened to all those other people who were in that crack house with you over on Boulevard and Ponce. I said, what happened to them? She said, you're the only one still alive. You know why they didn't get what I got? I got one more chance. I got one more chance. I needed a lot of chances, but I got one more chance. And I had a community that cared for me. They didn't have any of that. And you know, I've spent, you heard me say earlier, I've spent the last 28 years at Hazel and Betty Ford saying addiction doesn't discriminate, and neither should recovery, but it does. And it's not right. So they're gone. I think about them all the time. I think about those men and women in that crack house all the time who were no different than I was, except for two things. One was the color of their skin, and the other one wasn't. They weren't going to get another chance. So thank you for asking that. We honor them tonight. Jeff.
Hi, William. Thanks for being here.
Jeannie.
First, I want to repeat what I've told you before, that your first book, Broken, changed my life, taught me about addiction when our son was also in Ridgeview, and, put my wife and I on a path to family recovery, so appreciate that. The follow-up question is, I'm just curious, because you're a public figure and you obviously have a high position at Hazelton, that make it any harder to kick the opiates or easier? Because I could see it both ways, both the pressure and the motivation.
It made it harder because I felt like I had to live up to what you expected of me. I mean, I'm doing that my whole life, right? One of my defects of character is I'm a perfectionist. You know how hard it is to be a perfectionist in the body of a human being? It's impossible because we're all flawed people. But I had to live up to that, and I wanted everybody to be inspired and right and Broken. I mean, it's in its fourth printing, darn it. It just won't go away. So I had to always live up to it. It was really hard. And also because I have what I call a God box at home. It's a little box that a psych nurse made me at an AA convention back in the late 90s in San Diego. She made me a God box, and she said, put your medallions in there. And medallions are what we get in 12-step recovery when we get another day or another year or a decade, and they mean a lot, right? But it was suggested that maybe I would have to empty out my God box and start all over again. We don't do that to women who have a remission of breast cancer. If their breast cancer comes back, we don't say, well, darn, that was a waste of remission. No, we don't. We don't. And so I was raised in a program that celebrates continuous sobriety. Wonderful, right? But how hard is it to stay continuously sober and with a chronic disease? It's tricky. And there I was, I wasn't doing it. That's why I learned that for me, there's more to my recovery than sobriety. Sobriety is a good thing. It's important for a lot of us, but it's impractical at times for some of us. So, and besides, what is sobriety if you're smoking cigarettes in AA meetings? I'm not going to take issue with it. I'm just going to say, what is sobriety if you're using nicotine to the detriment of your own well-being? So it was hard. And when I finally revealed on the stage at the Betty Ford Center in February of 2016 that I was taking this miracle drug called Suboxone, I thought that they were going to like stand up and give me an ovation, right? Well, it wasn't quite that easy. I had a lot of explaining to do. And so my own employer was perplexed, to say the least, by the fact that I had more to my story. I've come to accept it now. Obviously, I've written a book. Oh, I want to just thank you and your wife, Jean. Is it Jean or Jeannie? Jean, you're starting a new program. They've called it Williams House, but it's not for me. But I love it anyway. You sent me a shirt, and I wear it around town. And I think, Williams House, where is that? I say, it's in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's got nothing to do with me. So anyway, thanks for being here.
I'm an addict. I got 2 years.
Yay.
In a week. I got 2 years in a week.
All right, man.
In 1 week, I have two. Anyways, so as an addict, Suboxone is part of my story, and
cool.
it has nothing to do with recovery, though, for me. And so I have a question out of like genuine curiosity.
Please.
Because I do believe in all pathways as well. But I guess I'm just wondering, what's the difference like between, like when you decide to take 3 instead of 2?
Yeah.
Like where's that line at with the Suboxone, or how do you manage that? Like how is that not an issue, or is that
Not an issue. I take it as prescribed.
okay?
You know, my addiction doc in Minneapolis, Dr. David Friends, who's, I don't know if you know him, Paul, but he's really been important to me, not just in terms of dealing with my opioid use disorder, but also in sort of the evolution of my journey, helping me understand, you know, my socialized mind versus my self-oriented mind. I'm still working on that. But I just take my meds, you know, the way they're prescribed. And if we do that, they tend to be good meds.
Yes, sir.
Whatever they're for. So that's how I deal with it. Does that help? Hold on 1 second. Ambassador Young, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you. Thank you. I have given thousands of talks over the years, and I've never had an ambassador in the audience, and so I am honored.
We're just going to do 2 more questions tonight. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of your great questions, but William will be personalizing books after this if you want to chat further. We'll have 1 more in person. I have 1 written one as well. Thank you.
Should I go ahead? Yeah. Mr. Moyers, it's a pleasure to be here and to hear your story. Of course, we have all kind of life experiences and background differences. Painkillers, of course, I'm not an addict or anything as such, but I'm a former athlete. And of course, you know, life experiences now are taking toll. You know, I even done freelance journalism. I'm learning things like advocacy. Of course, a field medicine professional, sports medicine professional, and a coach. So working with somebody who has your experiences and things like that, you know, you just want to know what you can do to help.
Yeah.
And how to help. I walk Peachtree 2 or 3 times a week. And of course, I look to help others,
Yes.
homeless. You see different lives on the street. But from my expertise and experience now, recovery and advocacy is the biggest thing that you've been seeing.
Yes.
In Atlanta. I want to know how much recreation and leisure, even to like its finest points, you know, holistically, have helped you get to where you're point. I'm hearing things like, you know, there are some others in the audience saying that there are 12-step programs, there are things like that. But how much, even to like your next person here, the next person in place, how much is recreation and leisure has been a good approach and a good resource to you?
I'll just tell you real quick, we know that addiction is an illness of the mind, the body, and the spirit. And so the antidote to it, which is recovery, is also to take care of the mind and the body and the spirit. And for a lot of us, exercise, stress reduction, and faith, and those things are important to tending to the garden of our minds, bodies, and spirits. I like to exercise. I still run at age 65. I lift weights lightly. I do those things because they make me feel better about who I am and what I'm doing. That's a short answer. Thank you. Yes. Oh, this is our last one. Okay, this is our last question. And this is a very good one. Thank you for asking it. Did your own children escape addiction? I'm ready for that question. I don't get it very much, and I write about it in the new book with their permission. So I'm going to tell you a story as we close, because we're going to close, right, Claire? And isn't she been great? She and this whole team. Man, what a team. So this is a very fitting way to close. So you know I have 3 children, Henry, Thomas, and Nancy. They are the product of 2 alcoholic parents. Their mother and I are recovering people. So we met through the recovery experience very early on, 1989, 1990. So Henry, Thomas, and Nancy know where their parents came from, how we met. They know where Dad works at Hazel and Betty Ford. We took them to 12-step meetings because it's a great place to take young kids for an hour, you know. But we also took them there so they could see that it wasn't weird, you know, and that it was a good thing, and so on and so forth. And so around the dinner table, growing up, unlike when I was raised by my parents, Bill and Judith Moyers, we talked about the war in Vietnam, Watergate, long gas lines, birds and the bees, all those things, but we never talked about addiction, because we didn't think we needed to. Well, in this Moyers household, we talked to our kids about addiction all the time. We told them that they're genetically vulnerable because of the product of 2 alcoholic parents, which means that they're much more at high risk than their using buddies or their school classmates. So we told them all of that stuff. We talked to them about treatment. Their pictures are in broken, you know, it was early on, et cetera, et cetera. And we asked them to wait until they were 21 if they were going to experiment. Now, why would we ask our children to wait until they were 21? For one thing, that's the law. It may not have been the law in our generations. The drinking age may have been 18, but for the same reason that texting and driving is illegal today, it's illegal to drink until you're 21. I know that's counter to the legalization of marijuana issues. That's another thing. But we said, kids, we don't want you to use until you're 21 because it's against the law. And secondly, the last organ in the body to develop is the brain. Doctor, you know that, Dr. Harris. The last organ in the body to develop is the brain. And what happens in this organ? Decisions are made and risks are weighed. And when you inhale or drink or ingest a substance, it affects that, right? So we want our kids to wait until their brains are better formed. Great conversations, but I was no dummy. I knew that they probably would experiment, so I decided I would incentivize them too. I said, kids, if you wait until you're 21, I'll buy you a new car. Well, Henry's now 32, Thomas is 30, and Nancy's 27, and I didn't have to buy any of them a new car. They all used. They all experimented. Yeah. Well, thank goodness I gave them one other tool in their toolbox. And the tool was this. If you choose to use, you may not be able to choose the outcome. In which case, Henry, Thomas, and Nancy, it's okay to come to your parents and ask for help. How many of us were told that when we were growing up? It's okay to ask for help. Well, all 3 of my children have come to me and asked for help. Yep, and guess what? Thomas came to me, and I write about it in the book. With his permission, Thomas came to me and he said, Dad, I've stopped drinking, but I can't stop smoking weed. He was in college. He said, I need help. So we had him assessed at the world-renowned Hazelden Foundation, as we were then called. He was assessed as being dependent, which means what? Well, since we're an abstinence-based organization and you're assessed as being dependent, you should probably not use, right? He's 30 years old now. and he uses. But he uses responsibly. He doesn't have a problem anymore. He has recovered from the desperate condition that caused him to come to me and ask for help. And he recovers differently than I do, but he's recovering. No doubt about it. He's a fundraiser for Perkins School for the Blind, and he's one of the best ones in Boston. My daughter Nancy came to me and said, Dad, I've been binge drinking since I was 13. I was like, what do you mean? You've been living upstairs all that time. She goes, Dad, I've been binge drinking since I was 13. I need help. We had her assessed. She was assessed as being dependent. She subsequently had 2 treatments. She's been in recovery for 6 years now. She graduated from Columbia with her master's in LMSW from Columbia last year. She's a therapist in New York City, and she has been in recovery for 5 or 6 years. She recovers entirely differently than I do, but she's recovered from the desperate condition that caused her to come to me and ask for help. My oldest son, Henry, who's blessed to be cut from the same cloth I am and cursed to be cut from the same cloth that I am, Henry came to me about 2 years ago, and he said, Dad, when I drink to blackout. I need help. Until recently, when I had told that story, nothing had changed. But in January of a year ago, he started a program called Dry January. You might have heard of it, Dry January. It's got nothing, doesn't have the word recovery in it, it's just Dry January. And he's been recovered from the desperate condition that caused him to come to me 2.5 years ago. Point being, it's a good thing that we empower our children to ask for help. We respect the pathways that they journey on, even when it's not ours, and we continue to encourage them along their way. I think that is the best thing that could have ever happened. So,
William Cope Moyers, everyone, thank you. And we will meet you all out in the lobby. If you would like to get your book personalized or to purchase another, we will see you out there. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Tom Johnson and Edwina Johnson, the Addiction Alliance is here with us.